what I want to do is just say a little bit about our translation project, because the talk is based on the sort of fruits of that translation project. And this is a special issue that we are releasing as a result of this translation project on philanthropy and civil society in China. So let me just say that in terms of my title, I mean, I want to make clear that there's an organization called China Development Brief, and they publish, this is their website. So they are a spin-off of the old China Development Brief. It's the organizational evolution is very complex. I could spend a whole hour just talking about it, but I won't. But this is the Chinese website, and so they're an organization, and they're a nonprofit organization. They have a staff of writers and editors who publish reports on the nonprofit sector in China. So they are really China's longest running platform for information sharing and networking in China for the nonprofit sector. So most of their audience is Chinese NGOs, Chinese nonprofits. Some of the audience are also academics, and then there are a smaller number of people from the government sector or business sector that also read this publication. In any case, I've been in China about 5 years now, and I live in Beijing, and I was glad to see some haze on the horizon because it made me feel right at home here in New York City. But so I lived in Beijing for 5 years doing research, writing about Chinese NGOs, the nonprofit sector. I have a blog, and I published several things on this topic. And at some point, I felt like I would like to somehow help these nonprofits that I've been interviewing, and that they had. I mean, I just was fascinated by the work they were doing, and under sometimes difficult conditions. And so I decided to approach this Chinese organization, the Chinese Development Brief, and I offered to basically translate the materials into English, because I think not many people knew what was going on with the nonprofit sector since the old China Development Brief shut down, and I think we needed a new source of information. And I felt like the reports, the writing that this organization did was valuable enough that it should be translated into English. So I have this translation project right now. I work with the China Development Brief people. This is a project under their organization. So I want to make that clear that this is not some new organization that's sprung up, and this is just a project within this Chinese organization. And so this is their website, and then this is our website. And we just started up. We've been doing this I approached them last fall, and they kindly agreed to let me work with them. And they are a group of very dedicated and conscientious people who have great networks and contacts with the nonprofit world. And it's I have to say that the work I've been doing with them in terms of helping them has been is fascinating and meaningful. And I want to thank my wife especially for being so understanding, for letting me kind of take on this work, because I used to be a professor, and I used to be teaching, and I'm doing less of that. My day job used to be teaching, and now I think it's kind of evolved into doing the translation project, and now my night work is more teaching on the side. So that's a little bit about my evolution. But this is kind of what we've developed over the last. This is like a month and a half old right now, and so there's what we've tried to do is put up there are NGO resources, and what we're doing is translating, for example, laws and regulations that are related or relevant to the nonprofit sector. I hope to have some statistics up there. We have a whole bibliography of works on Chinese civil society, the whole nonprofit sector, that is up for scholars who are interested in the nonprofit sector. We have articles, news and analysis. We have profiles of people, interviews with people, profiles of organizations. There's nothing here in the directories, but we're hoping to update. China Development Brief had some directories of Chinese NGOs and international NGOs in China. And right now I have an intern who's helping me update the international NGO directory. The special issues is something that we're also doing, and the first one will be this one on philanthropy and civil society. And then we have announcements on jobs funding, project bidding, conferences. This is all, again, all this stuff is translated from the China Development Brief website. So it just gives you a sense of, the content of their website. And this is only a small part of what they put on their website. But what I've done is tried to select, translate, and edit articles that I think would be of interest to an international audience. So that's what my role is. And our mission, I guess the mission of this project is to basically improve understanding and cooperation between the international community and China's nonprofit sector, and to strengthen that sector's visibility and voice in the international community. Because I think not enough is said about the nonprofit world in China, because they tend to do their work quietly. They try to avoid controversy. So the media doesn't tend to report on what they do unless there's usually bad news, like when a nonprofit gets closed down or something. But that is really a very small part of what is going on in the nonprofit world. And these are people who are very committed to providing services and promoting social change in China. So this is China Development Brief's translation project, and then we have our special issue. So what I've done for the special issue is translate 12 articles that this is reporting by the China Development Brief staff on philanthropy and civil society issues. And so these 12 articles make up that special issue. And the talk that I'm going to give is based on the findings in those 12 articles. And I found, when I first approached the China Development Brief, they were like, to translate this stuff, they were, I think, a little incredulous. They said, well, are you sure people are really interested in reading what we have to say? And I said, sure. And I didn't know myself if that was really true or not, but I found in reading and editing these reports that they do offer a really in-depth and insightful glimpse into what is going on in the world of philanthropy. So I'm glad that it actually was worthwhile. I do want to ask that if anybody's interested in getting future emails, I'm going to try and put out monthly updates about what we put on. Then please provide me with your name cards, and I'll put you on the mailing list. I thought what I'd do is first to start just by talking about what constitutes the nonprofit or civil society sector in China, because that's very difficult to understand. I mean, and to try to translate that for an international audience that is used to nonprofits, maybe like in the United States. So I'd like to just kind of talk a little bit about that. And then what I want to do in the time remaining is basically talk about the findings of this reporting. And I broke those findings down into the good, the bad, and the murky. So for lack of a better way of structuring it, and with apologies to who's it, Sergio Leone?
Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, so let's just dive right into what the nonprofit NGO sector is. So, of course, I'm just putting this up for people who may be new to this area, but in terms of what the international definitions of nonprofit NGO sectors are referred to, organizations, networks, movements that are voluntary, they're non-governmental, they're self-governing. And it goes by very many names: civil society sector, the philanthropic sector, the third sector. So the first sector is the government, the second sector is business, the third sector is the nonprofit world. And why is it important? I think there's many reasons why I think this nonprofit world is important. Filling gaps in service delivery. I mean, a lot of nonprofits provide important services, social services. Independent advocacy and supervision, so that's another role that it plays, advocating for new policies, changes in the laws. It's also a source of creative ideas and flexible solutions. I think it's also important because it allows for self-improvement as a person, as a citizen, to actually participate in nonprofits. You become, a better person, and you become more engaged in your community. And lastly, building social capital, building trust and networks, and bringing people together to solve problems from different sectors. So those are all important reasons why I think important functions of the nonprofit sector. All right, so this is a chart that I had from a book that I edited about Chinese NGOs about 2 years ago. And it was an attempt to try to capture the landscape of these organizations on a spectrum from this from organizations that were tied to the state or part of the state on the left-hand side, and then organizations that were really more independent on the right-hand side. So the organizations in red are government agencies, public institutions like most universities in China are Shia Danwei, state-owned enterprises. Those are all part of what we call the state. Then there's these organizations that are kind of what I call quasi-state organizations that are kind of in the gray, neighborhood and village committees at the very basic level, mass organizations like the Communist Youth League, the All China Federation of Trade Unions, the Women's Federation. These are all mass organizations that also are closely tied to the state. So I call those quasi-state organizations. And then below that, there's a whole bunch of like these organizations that are usually called social organizations in China, 社会组织, and there's a range, and in terms of the I guess theoretically, I mean, that the nonprofit sector in China really consists of these organizations, primarily the ones listed towards the right. So NGOs registered as social organizations, SOs, NGOs registered as popular non-enterprise units, which are kind of service delivery. They're supposed to be more service delivery organizations. NGOs registered as foundations, and then NGOs registered as business entities and unregistered NGOs. So those are all, the first three, the registered NGOs, the one registered SOs, PNEUs, and foundations are all registered with civil affairs. So those technically that's supposed to be the nonprofit sector in theory. But of course, this being China, there's a very broad range of what is actually referred to as nonprofits. And that includes things that are tied to the state. So mass organizations sometimes will refer to themselves as like nonprofits or NGOs. And then there are these gongos. And actually this chart is not quite, I mean, I don't have the technical ability to sort of show all the permutations on this chart, but gongos are like government organized non-governmental organizations, right? So there's a lot of contradictions in China, and this is one of them. And those are also referred to as nonprofits as well, or NGOs. And then there are these semi-gongos or semi-NGOs. There are NGOs that are kind of attached to another gongo or maybe a research institution or a university and gain legitimacy in that way, but they're not registered. And I guess you could call those somewhat unregistered NGOs. I should also mention that the NGOs registered as SOs, as social organizations, a number of those are actually gongos. They've been set up by some government agency, or they have close ties with some government agency or mass organization. So the theory is that those NGOs are registered with civil affairs are supposed to be in the nonprofit sector, but in practice, the range of nonprofits is actually much wider. Includes gongos, and it also includes toward the bottom the NGOs are registered as businesses. So this is another contradiction in terms, right? A for-profit, not-for-profit. I mean, but a lot of those are actually what we would think of as independent NGOs. And so that gives you some sense of the landscape. And there's a lot, I guess you can think of this more as a spectrum. There's no clear-cut, of course, distinctions between the state and these non-governmental organizations. Is more of a spectrum from more stateless to less stateless or less or greater autonomy. This is just like something else I took from our book, but it just gives you some specific examples of organizations that kind of fall in these different categories. So again, government agencies toward the left, and more independent NGOs on the right. And I guess China Development Brief would belong more on that category of NGOs. So I don't have time to kind of go through this, but just to give you a sense of like the growth of legally registered NGOs in China. These are just NGOs that are registered with civil affairs. So the social organizations, the ones registered as social organizations, are in the gray. The ones registered as PNEUs, 民办非企业, are that orange shaded bar. So you can see they've risen quite rapidly since 1996. Actually, since 1998, because they only came about since 1998 when there was a regulation for those kinds of organizations. Here's another chart showing the growth of these are again registered NGOs. So the Sichuan are the social organizations, the ones in blue. The Minfei, the PNEUs are the registered. Those are the ones in the maroon color, and that goes up to 2008. So again, you can kind of see a growth in these are legally registered NGOs. Foundations in China, the growth of foundations has been quite rapid. The total number of foundations is indicated in that blue line. The red line is there are two kinds of foundations. So there's what's called public fundraising foundations, and I just call those public foundations. Then the other kind are non-public fundraising foundations, and I call those private foundations, just as a shorthand. And most of the public foundations they're what we call gongos. They're established. They have close ties with the government or mass organizations, and you can see that they have grown fairly slowly over the last couple of years. In 2004, there was a new regulation appeared for foundation management, and it created a new category of foundations called private foundations. And you can see that the number of these are usually foundations started up by like entrepreneurs or companies, right? A major gift from an entrepreneur or a company. And you can see that they have risen very rapidly since 2004. And in fact, in this year, both public foundations and private foundations have exceeded the 1,000 mark. So, and they're about neck to neck now. So, which is quite amazing that the number of given that private foundations only started in 2004, that they already rival in number the public foundations. Of course, they don't have as many assets as the public foundations. I think public foundations comprise about 70% of total foundation assets in China. There's other numbers that I didn't include that aren't included in these charts. There are some. It's hard to know what the numbers are. People toss up crazy numbers up. I mean, somebody says 2 million. Wang Ming of Tsinghhua's NGO Research Center estimates there might be 2.5 million grassroots associations. It's really hard to say. Some of these are very small. They're not registered. They're community-based. They're rural. They're technical associations in the countryside that bring people together to talk about sheep herding or growing growing strawberries, things like this. So and then there are there are, in terms of registered NGOs registered as businesses, he estimates there's about 200,000. Again, I tend to think these numbers are inflated, but it gives you a sense of the size of China's nonprofit world. Just to put it into perspective, though, if you compare it to the U.S., and I just pulled some of these comparisons from the reports that I translated, the total annual budget for China's environmental NGOs is about 30 to 50 million, about 5 to 7 million U.S. dollars, compared to about 3 billion U.S. dollars in the U.S. for environmental NGOs. So Chinese support for environmental NGOs is about 1,000th the level of support in the U.S. Another comparison. Foundations per capita. The U.S. has about one foundation per 3,000 people. Taiwan has roughly about one foundation per 4,600 people. China, even though the foundations have grown quite rapidly, only has one foundation per 650,000. So again, we're talking about a small, relatively small, but growing sector. The total assets of 1,288 foundations in China. There's more than that, but that's the bulk of the foundations in China in 2009 amounted to about 39 billion yuan. That's about 11% of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation assets. So that gives you a sense of, again, this is a sector that is just getting started. Let me just say let me kind of just say a few things about the trends that we've noticed. And so I organized them, as I said, into the good, the bad, and the murky. So some good trends is that in terms of, I titled this talk, Same Bed, Different Dreams. And, philanthropy and civil society or nonprofits should be they are in the same bed. They're part of that nonprofit sector. But it's not clear whether they both have the same dream or not, the same goal. But I think a good trend is that there are a group of foundation leaders that are committed to increasing transparency, accountability, and professionalism in the philanthropy sector, and also to encourage foundations to support nonprofits. And so I list some of the foundations that are at the head of this. These are private foundation leaders that are pushing for these kinds of changes. So Narada, and their websites are all up, and they have also websites in English. U-Change, Vantone, Tencent, which I realize is not probably a good name for a foundation. It's just a cheap foundation, but Tencent. And then the Society for Ecology and Entrepreneurs is a foundation that was put together by a bunch of entrepreneurs who were interested in environmental protection. So these are some of the foundations that are at the head of this initiative. Secondly, another good trend is that there are a number of foundation initiatives that have happened over the last year, but have been building over the last decade. And now, in the last 2 years, we've seen the fruition of some of these efforts. And one of these is the China Private Foundation Forum, and they've met twice. They've held 2 sessions, one in July 2009 and another in October 2010. It has 14 founding members. The foundations I mentioned earlier are some of those founding members. And their goal is, again, to try to promote transparency and accountability and professionalism, and to encourage foundations to support nonprofits. And then another major event that happened last year in July of 2010 is the establishment of the China Foundation Center. The China Foundation Center is modeled along the U.S. Foundation Center. So it's interesting. A lot of these philanthropic leaders see the U.S. as their model, because I think Europe does not quite have that same tradition of philanthropy that the U.S. does. So they partnered with the U.S. Foundation Center, and this China Foundation Center has 35 founding members. 15 of those members are public foundations, and 20 are private foundations. Another sort of initiative that's important that was not covered in the special issue, but is the registration in Shenzhen of the One Foundation. The One Foundation is established by the martial arts superstar Jet Li, and he originally had been he had been using a special account in the Red Cross, the Chinese Red Cross, to raise money, because as a private foundation you can't engage in public fundraising. So he had been using the Red Cross to do that. In December of just last year, just a few months ago, he was able to register One Foundation as a public foundation. So this is the first time I think that a private foundation had been registered as a public foundation. So a real major event in the foundation world. And Jet Li's been a real supporter of grassroots NGOs, and he's recently received major gifts from 4 other foundations, and some of China's wealthiest and most influential entrepreneurs have joined its board. So that's been a major event. Another good trend is that, because of the rapid rise of these private foundations, it's really provided an alternative source of funding for many Chinese nonprofits. And this is a positive trend for several reasons. First of all, I don't know if people know, but a lot of nonprofits got their start with international funding. But a number of international foundations, NGOs, are reducing their funding commitments in China. I think they no longer see China as a developing country anymore, for maybe good reason. But it's also good, this is also a good trend, because I think domestic funding is seen as maybe less politically sensitive. So it would be great if these foundations could serve as a source of funding for nonprofits, and it looks like there are a number of foundations that are now beginning to give to nonprofits. So that's a good trend. Another good trend, I think, is that there's more interest from a wide range of philanthropic organizations, both GONGOs, government-organized public foundations, and private foundations in supporting independent nonprofits, especially after the Sichuan earthquake that happened in 2008. That was, I think, a kind of a watershed event. It really got these nonprofits on the map, on the radar of these GONGOs and public foundations, and they began to fund more of these nonprofits and supporting them through the use of special accounts, as are detailed in some of these articles. And these special accounts allow these organizations to engage in some kind of public fundraising. So those are all good trends. After the earthquake, the Chinese Red Cross, for example, dispersed about 20 million yuan to projects, and many of these projects were managed by grassroots NGOs for rebuilding the earthquake-stricken areas in Sichuan. Actually, my son actually did a volunteer stint for like 6 weeks in one of these projects that was started by Global Village, which is a Beijing-based environmental NGO. It was to rebuild a village there, and he had a great time. I also talked about these special accounts. Public foundations have the ability to engage in public fundraising. They can go on the internet and ask for donations. They can go on TV. They can go to newspapers. Private foundations cannot do that. They have to rely on these major gifts. So what the public foundations are starting to do is provide special accounts for some of these nonprofits or private foundations to engage, to allow them to engage in fundraising, public fundraising. So that's been another good trend. So those are all good things that have been happening over the last few years. The bad things, and I think I have a few more bad things than good, but the bad trends are that philanthropy is still dominated by GONGOs and by public foundations with government ties. So this sector continues to be plagued by bureaucratic norms of decision-making, lack of transparency and accountability, and there's the one found. The Red Cross Society. I was going to show you, their website. If you go on their website, they actually have a donation page. If you go on the websites of private foundations, there is no donation page because, again, they're not allowed to fundraise publicly. But the Red Cross Society of China is. But anyway, there's a couple of scandals occurred in the Red Cross world, as you may have known. So this is one of them was, I guess, a fa piao, a receipt that was. This is under the name of the Shanghai, some district in Shanghai. They're a Red Cross, a local Red Cross branch, and I guess they had a restaurant bill for 9,859 yuan. That's for 17 people. It was a meal for 17 people. That's about $1,500 US, so about $88 US dollars per person, which is a little excessive. And so that got microblogged, got all over the internet, and a lot of people criticized the Red Cross. The Red Cross said that this expense was taken from the administrative expenses, not from money that was raised publicly, so it wasn't from public donations. But in any case, it was a big scandal. And then the most recent one is this woman, Guo Mei, who is pictured here, I think, in a Lamborghini or something like that. She was texting about how she is she was claiming to be the general manager of the Red Cross. I guess they have a commercial outfit associated with it. And her boyfriend was on the board of this commercial outfit, and he resigned after these pictures came out, and then it's just caused a lot of discussion about and more, I think, distrust about these kinds of public foundations and the lack of transparency in the foundational world, which is a good thing. I mean, this is a conversation that's been going on since the Sichuan earthquake about trying to increase accountability, because after the Sichuan earthquake, China broke records in terms of public donations. I think amount of public donations broke like the 100 billion yuan mark, and that was like up from I think the year before it was something like it was like 30 billion yuan. So it really jumped in 2008. Most of that money went for earthquake relief, and most of that earthquake relief money, about 90%, went to Chinese Red Cross and the Chinese Federation, the China Charity Federation, and to the Ministry of Civil Affairs. So basically went to all these government organizations or GONGOs. And that started a whole conversation about should all these public donations be going to a few of these organizations, and are they accountable for the funds that they're getting? Another sort of negative trend is that there's a number of vested interests in the current philanthropy system. A number of NGOs and public foundations that enjoy many privileges, and this is going to make the philanthropy sector difficult to reform. So just one example is the China Charity Federation, which is a very powerful player in the philanthropy world. The China Charity Federation has even closer ties to the government than the Chinese Red Cross. At the local level, China Charity Federation is paid by local government. Their staff is paid by the local government. They are pretty much an agency of the local government. And so there's been a lot of controversy about that. And, there's about 5 minutes. Okay, so there's another negative trend. There's no major breakthroughs in the regulatory environment at this point. I mean, private foundations and NGOs still face a lot of constraints in terms of fundraising, legal registration, capacity building, legitimacy. There's been some reforms, some regulatory reforms, but fairly minor, that have made it somewhat easier for certain categories of nonprofits to register. And this kind of uncertain regulatory environment also pushes foundations to fund projects and organizations in less risky sectors. So, like education, poverty relief, and environmental protection, and to stay away from the more sensitive areas like legal aid or advocacy. There's also another negative trend is that I think there's still the foundation world, the whole nonprofit world is still very diverse. It's a very diverse sector. There's still a gap in philosophy, practice, and communication between nonprofits on one hand and foundations on the others. I mean, nonprofits have been around in China longer than foundations, and they're used to these international practices and standards because they've worked very closely with usually international organizations, international foundations. So they have different standards of what it means, of what grant making means. Whereas Chinese foundations have really different ideas and approaches. They're new to grant making. They're still trying to figure out what their role is, what their mission is. So there's this kind of gap between the two. And this is why I titled my talk, same bed, but maybe different dreams. And there's also differences in views among private foundations. I think there's many private foundations that are strongly influenced by corporate values and culture, and they see philanthropy primarily as a way to promote their public relations or to promote government relations. And this is a good example, I guess, of one person who's kind of engaged in that approach. Chen Guangbiao is one of the wealthiest philanthropists in China, and his sort of model of philanthropy is basically go out with a bunch of cash and just kind of give it to, farmers out in the countryside. And so he gives out and gives 100 yuan bills and says, this is his way of making an impact because it's more direct. It kind of gets around all the red tape and the paperwork. And I think there's some philanthropists there are some foundations that are really committed to, I think, social values, to trying to increase transparency, and those are the foundations that I listed up before this about the ones that are the sort of leaders pushing for changes in the philanthropy world. But it's still a very diverse sector. A lot of foundations are still trying to find their way. There's still a lot of debates about the direction in which nonprofits and philanthropy should move. Should nonprofits cooperate with, NGOs and the government, or should they try and rely more on international funding? So I think, just as an upshot, conclusion that it's still too early in the process. It's still unclear whether foundations are willing to move in a more to become more transparent, to become more accountable, and to become more supportive of NGOs. And I'll just close with a quote that I got from a prominent foundation and a nonprofit leader who said, this is in this private foundation forum that was held a year ago. She said, private foundations and grassroots organizations are a critical link in public welfare, and our common mission is to improve Chinese society. We have to bear in mind that our cause has another function that can't be ignored. Although we're constantly engaged in one project after another, what we have to remember is the bigger picture, and that is that we are creating a new society in China. And the goal of the new society requires us not just to go about doing projects and complaining about each other, but to find a deeper common purpose and a clear idea of how to realize that goal. And I think that's what she's calling for, is to say that foundations and nonprofits should have the same dream rather than different dreams. So we'll wait and see. But I think right now I'm optimistic about the way that things are moving. So maybe I'll stop there.
Okay, can you turn the lights on? Thank you, Shawn. We're sorry to have limited you to a certain amount of time, because clearly you have a lot of material and all of it really interesting, especially the National Committee has long been interested in this sector, having brought, in fact, the first delegation from China back in 1990 to look at the nonprofit sector here and learn from it. And clearly, China has come a very long way, but has, when you look at some of your statistics, a long way to go. I know there's a lot of people here with an interest in this field and a lot of questions, so let me open it up. When you ask a question, please just tell us who you are and where you work, and we have about another 15 minutes for questions. So, who would like to start? Okay, go ahead, Charles.
Charles Wong here. I'll put on the head as the head of China AIDS Fund, which we started in New York to help the AIDS problem in China.
But Charles has long been involved and interested, and a wonderful person involved in helping nonprofits here in the city.
Okay.
And also I want to preface by saying that today you're competing with the governor of Zhejiang province. Who is here. To come here rather than over there.
Well, thank you.
I want to meet you and I want to congratulate you for what you have done. But my question is that recently we encountered some problem. In the past, when we chose to support a NGO in China, there's never a problem. Just send a check over and they'll be able to cash it. But recently, maybe the law has changed. They can no longer cash a check.
It might be. I mean, there's new regulations that came out, I think, what was it, the end of 2009, or just, yeah, this is by the State Administration of Foreign Exchange. So it makes it more difficult for organizations to, if the funds are coming into, from overseas into a Chinese bank and to convert to renminbi, it's more difficult for them to get a hold of the renminbi. They have to go through more paperwork. There has to be some kind of notarization, apparently, procedures that have to be gone through. So yeah, I think that's another kind of another set of regulations that has been added, and it's been, I think, trying to control the flow of, I think, foreign money into China. And I mean, I've heard of many organizations that have succeeded in getting the money once it gets deposited, but it is more difficult, and especially for smaller organizations, who don't have the ability to maybe get the notarization, or I mean, and it also depends on the bank that the organization is working with. If they have a good working relationship with the bank, then usually it's not so bad. I mean, but yeah, we've heard more and more difficulties with getting money, getting funding. And that, again, that's another reason why I think these private foundations and domestic funding, Chinese funding, will become more important, because it avoids having to get foreign exchange money from the bank, from these foreign exchange from the bank.
And it's clearly something that can be used. On the one hand, you applaud it, because definitely one of the problems that NGOs have in any country, but particularly in China, and particularly as it starts up, in making sure that their finances are all above board, not just someone sitting there with a box and throwing money in. And clearly proper accounting procedures are very important. On the other hand, it's something that the government can use when it wishes to, a la some people who some of us in this room know who've been put in jail because it's claimed that their accounting wasn't legit.
Right.
So it's a double-edged sword.
It is.
Both your good and bad.
Right. So I mean, the Chinese government, I think, is engaged right now in this effort to try to figure out how to better regulate this sector. But of course, regulation has those two sides, right? It's on one hand to control, but on the other hand to manage and hopefully improve, that sector. And I think right now what you're seeing is an attempt. Especially the people in the Ministry of Civil Affairs trying to figure out how best to regulate a sector that has kind of, I think, it's kind of gotten out of its ambit, out of its control.
Mm-hmm. Jerry?
Geraldine Kunstadter, Albert Kunstadter Family Foundation. We've been making grants in China since about 1985. Started with CICET, the China International Center for Economic and Technical Exchanges. They came here in '84, I think it was, underwritten by the Ford Foundation, to travel around the country and find foreign NGOs, U.S. NGOs, who would go to China to work on specific projects that they would identify. And we started with a very small grant to them, and that continued until there was a change, and CICET turned into CANGO, China Association for NGO Cooperation.
Right.
And we've been making a small grant for them, 15 or 10, I don't know, a long time. And our grant is used for supplies in their office and to print their newsletter in both English and Chinese. And it's always been that we make a wire transfer from our account into their bank account. Now we have to have a written contract, which they write up for me. I sign it as the chairman or president, and then the head of Congo signs it as the head of Congo.
Right.
But that's all that we've been very lucky. The grant we make to Tsinghua University for the Institute for International Studies, which keeps changing its name, they haven't bothered us. Tsinghua must have a rather special place in the scheme of things. We haven't had any problem like that.
Right. There's certain nonprofits or certain organizations that are exempted from this regulation. We have the translation of the regulation on our website.
Yes,
so
I have.
You have the translation as well. Yeah, right. And like in the Congo is well connected as well. So I would imagine that they wouldn't have any problem.
Yeah, but we need to have the contract signed.
Right.
Sort of in your closing of your remarks, you alluded to the fact of perhaps different dreams, but also I think it raises a point that I've heard discussed a fair amount, that there's a lot of activity out there, there's a need for more accountability, but there's also just a need for training, both of philanthropists, as well as of NGO leaders. And I wondered if you would be able to comment at all on what you see happening on that front in China. I think Beijing Normal University has been working toward that aim, but would just appreciate anything more you could tell us about that.
Yeah, I think part of this is just trying to get an understanding of how philanthropy works in other countries, right? So part of that training is in the form of exchanges. So people coming from China, from the Foundation World China, and visiting foundations here. And I think there was a visit. Was it last year? But there was, they're trying to organize, groups to engage in that kind of exchange. There's, of course, what you're bringing over are the foundations who really are committed to these ideals, and what you need is to try and get those other foundations involved as well. And so, yeah, I agree that training is important, and I think the Foundation Center may be one place where that will happen. I'm not sure if at this point. Right now they're busy. The Foundation Center right now is putting most of their work into creating a database of foundations and of their assets and their gifts and how they spend their money. So they're right now trying to put out this database. They just released a report that they're trying to translate into English. So hopefully that report will be made available. It's something like the Independent Report on Chinese Philanthropy. And but yeah, I think training training is going to be important, and just I think also more contacts with the nonprofit world. I think one thing that is lacking between Chinese foundations and NGOs and nonprofits is kind of is trust. I mean, and there's I think a lot of nonprofits kind of view these Chinese foundations somewhat skeptically. They think that Chinese foundations they don't know how to engage in grant making. They're not supportive of nonprofits. They ask for too many reports, for them to jump through too many hoops. They talk about Chinese foundations as being kind of condescending to nonprofits. So there's obviously also like a kind of this kind of cultural gap between nonprofits and foundations, and how to best close that. I'm not sure, but certainly probably more events and more maybe training workshops to where they can meet would be great as well.
Yes.
You mentioned
Can you tell us your
My
name?
name is Stephen.
I'm sorry, from where?
I'm from the Nutrition Brown You mentioned microblogging at one point.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak about whether or not sort of informal online communities have efficacy in building the nonprofit sector. Do you see any trends happening?
Yeah, I think there are. I mean, there's the internet itself and microblogging are all important in terms of helping these nonprofits communicate with one another. Let's see, there is microblogging is now used by, I think, a lot of nonprofits. A lot of nonprofits don't have the capacity to build these websites, and so microblogging becomes an effective way to sort of get their message out and to network with other nonprofits. And so I think there's there's a project underway, like it's called NGO 2.0, started by this MIT professor who is holding training sessions for a number of grassroots NGOs to help them use microblogging and other online tools, so they don't have to build extensive websites. Yeah.
Thank you.
Peggy Blumenthal from the Institute of International Education. I wondered whether there was any, you saw as a useful training resource the NGO and foundation communities in Hong Kong and Taiwan. And I ask because thanks to the Luce Foundation, over about a dozen years ago, we brought Chinese leaders of NGOs, women leaders from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and PRC who hardly ever talk, and we brought them to the United States, and the training they got here was great, but actually I think they learned more from each other.
Mm-hmm. And
I wonder if that's still happening, or whether there are ways that can maybe be more useful for them than trying to learn from the American sector, which is really quite different.
Right. Yeah, and I do see some of that learning occurring. I'm not. I can't. Let me see. I can't think of anything in terms. I mean, there are a number of Hong Kong foundations that are involved in China, obviously, and a number of Hong Kong nonprofits that are also working together with Chinese nonprofits. So yes, I mean that has been going on for some time.
How about Taiwan?
Taiwan. I mean, it's interesting. China sees. I think they also looked at Taiwan, or at least Chinese nonprofits looked at Taiwan as another sort of model. I mean, after the Sichuan earthquake, you saw important Taiwanese foundations like the Buddhist organization that participated in earthquake relief. So they have a presence in China, and I know that Chinese nonprofits have invited and talked and met together with Taiwanese foundations and nonprofits to talk about how they do philanthropy, how they engage in disaster relief and so forth in Taiwan. Because Taiwan had an earthquake, I forget, what was it, 1995 or something like that. So, where they had a similar kind of response from NGOs. So yeah, I think there's definitely learning going on between China, Taiwan, and Hong Kong.
On with Peggy's question, as the foundation community grows, apparently they need staff. Where are the trained staff coming from the university? Are there courses given in the university? How can we?
Right. And that's another thing. You talk about training. You talk about the. a lot of that, there's, I think, so now there are now beginning to be departments of, social work or nonprofit management. These are very new areas, right? So, but now they're just beginning
Social
to...
work wasn't new.
Well, it has different meaning, right? Yeah, nonprofit management. But so these things are just beginning to get started, and now you're beginning to see a new generation that's getting trained in these areas and are approaching nonprofit work in a much more professional way than the first generation. The first generation of these, NGO activists came from a very different background. I mean, they had no, they didn't have any training in nonprofit management. They didn't know what it meant to sort of grow an organization. And that's a problem in the foundation world too. One thing I forgot to mention was that one research report said that there's estimates about half of the private foundations are three no's foundations. That is, they have no full-time staff, they have no fixed location, and they apparently have no budget constraints. So that they're referred to as the Sanwu Jijinghui. So the three no's. But it indicates that there's a number of private foundations that aren't committed. They aren't committed to this idea of grant making and to building a staff that knows how to give grants and work with nonprofits in an effective way. I think a lot of these private foundations are interested in maybe doing their own projects as a way to highlight their brand or their company, or the entrepreneur who started it. That's the sense I get, is that the majority of foundations, private foundations in China, still have that kind of mindset.
Alice.
Yes, Alice Wong. One of the questions I'm curious about is, was it last year or 2 months ago when Warren Buffett
Right.
went to China, and then the publicity was that a lot of them in the beginning did not want to meet with the philanthropists, did not want to meet with them, and subsequently they were refused. Can you kind of talk about that trick, and is that, again, you talked about earlier the instance of Western foundations and so on, non-Chinese foundations, but philanthropists like that, are they kind of making an impact? Is that contributing to kind of the creation of some of these other private foundations, or kind of touch on that?
You mean, are you talking about whether Gates and Buffett's visits had a positive impact?
Yeah.
I mean,
what kind of impact? I don't know.
Yeah. I think it was. I mean, it's anything that I think brings greater visibility and publicity to this sector is good, because I think it starts to get people to think and to engage in discussions. And certainly Gates and Buffett's their visit sparked a lot of, I think, discussion among philanthropists. I mean, and also among people in the nonprofit world. I mean, some people thought it was sort of not in bad taste that it should just be rich people that should engage in philanthropy, and they made the point that that it's not just the wealthy that should engage in philanthropy, but philanthropy should be also for the ordinary people. So I think there was one group that tried to organize their own dinner in some downtown restaurant in Beijing, and they had a table reserved for Gates and Buffett, who of course didn't show up at that dinner. But, and then some of the things that we've translated, for example, the discussions and debate at the Second Private Foundation Forum, that engendered some discussion about what Gates and Buffett were trying to do, and discussion about what the Chinese call naked donations, where you kind of leave all your money to the foundation, nothing to to your the next generation, your family members, and so discussion about that, and discussion about what intelligent philanthropy or smart philanthropy should involve. Some people criticize people like Chen Guangbiao because they said, if you spend all your time trying to give out, if you have like 100 of million yuan and you're trying to give it out, it's not a very efficient way of dispersing philanthropy, and that you should think about building an organization and thinking about grant making as a more effective way. And they, some of these philanthropists refer to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation as kind of a model for grant making.
Okay, John, and then Helena. Last two questions.
We often, John Lowick from the National the Sichuan earthquake is often pointed to as this watershed moment, and I think we hear an awful lot about philanthropy going into the service, social service area and health. But what about the other side? I mean, so much of American philanthropy seems to be going into arts and cultural preservation and education, higher ed, and so forth. What are the trends going on there?
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, because I mean, another part of that nonprofit sector, at least for Americans, is that kind of expressive sector, and that is a sector that's kind of underdeveloped, and you don't see as much going into that sector. I mean, Chinese nonprofits have really traditionally been engaged in providing specific services, and maybe maybe there's that kind of element of the socialist legacy. I think there's a sense of responsibility that Chinese nonprofit people they have the sense of responsibility to the country. I think a sense of responsibility to address these kinds of very pressing social issues, environmental issues. And so maybe they just haven't had the time, the luxury, to think about other kinds, expression. But you are beginning to see slowly more of that. You're beginning to see more nonprofits that are devoted to culture, to forms of expression as a way also to highlight maybe social ills. For example, there are now some groups of these migrant organizations, migrant labor organizations that have they put on like these. They're like a troupe of traveling performers, and they use migrant workers as the performers, and so you begin to hear about these that they're putting on performances, musical performances, theater performances. So yeah, that's slowly I think coming into view. But yeah, that's traditionally I think not been a sector where you've seen much.
A more specific question, but before I get to it, just all of you had given name tags when you came in. Please feel free to leave them on the table and we'll recycle them for you. You don't need them to get out of the building. My question, sort of going back to the philanthropists and perhaps a sense of what their agendas are for giving away money and so on, but what is the current status of the tax regime toward foundations? Are there tax benefits for philanthropy? Is that an incentive now, or is it still kind of one of the murky areas?
It is still murky, but there is a tax incentive. I think it's like up to, for companies that want to contribute, up to 12% of, I can't remember what exactly, of their revenues or something. I can't. What's that?
Maybe profits?
Maybe it's profit. I can't remember. I have to go back and look at the actual regulations. But there are that they can receive tax exemptions for these donations that they make. Of course, these donations have to be to legally registered organizations. So usually donations to like the Chinese Red Cross or the Chinese Charity Federation, or to but a lot of like for nonprofits that are registered as businesses, if you give money to them, you can't get a tax write-off, right? So that's another sort of hurdle. It's another constraint, and and this is where I think legislation, and this comes in again and again. This is where legislation plays a critical role. I mean, to try to hopefully change the regulatory system and try to change the legislation. I think there's now there's a charity law that has been sort of where is it now? Probably maybe in the state council. Maybe got moved back to the National People's Congress Standing Committee, but it's been in the work. There's an attempt to try to get this Chinese charity law out that I think would improve the environment. But I was just thinking about like the Luce Foundation, which got established in the heyday of American philanthropy in the 1930s, and this is right after the federal government passed laws to give tax exemptions for charitable donations, and that had a huge impact on the foundation world here. So, but again, I think people, there are these tax exemptions, but also a lot of people don't really know about them. They're just, a lot of Chinese don't understand. They don't even know what philanthropy is. They don't know what these foundations are. They're a little bit distrustful of this whole world of philanthropy, which is why the Chinese Foundation Center's work is so important, because the China Foundation Center realizes that it needs to earn the trust of not just the government but also of society if they're going to be successful, if people are going to want to work and donate to these organizations.
And what is the standard term now for philanthropy?
It's Sichuan. Yeah, actually I forgot to talk about terminology, but Sichuan is the standard term for, so C-I and then S-H-A-N, Sichuan. What's that? For charity or philanthropy. Yeah.
It's the same.
Sichuan, so Sichuan 组织 is like a philanthropic organization. 公益组织, right now 公益组织 is like kind of, I think, the more preferred term. 公益 means public welfare. 公益 can be something that's appropriated by either the government or social organizations, which I think makes it more, maybe, it tends to be kind of the preferred term, I think, by the media, by the government. Civil society is not a term that that people tend to use. 民间组织 for non-profit organizations. 民间 means coming from the people. Is another frequent term. Or 社会组织.
I know there are a few other questions, but it's almost 10:15, so we want to let people go. They may have to get back. Why don't you come up and ask Shawn separately? I want to, on everybody's behalf, thank Shawn for coming. This is clearly a field that is so important, certainly in China, and to those who are concerned about China on the outside. It's also a very fluid one. So we hope you're going to come back, and that next time you talk, the good trends will outweigh the bad trends, which now you said you have more bad trends than good, and we hope that will change, and we hope you'll come back and tell us about them next time you're here.
Okay, thank you. And I just want to thank Luce and the National Committee and everybody for having me and hosting this talk. So thank you.